Welcome to Hadar's Web, a podcast featuring community conversations on spirituality, healing, justice, and art. My name is Hadar Cohen. I am your host, and I am delighted to invite you to my relational web. Today's guest is Layla Maghribi. Layla Maghribi is a British mixed Arab journalist, writer, and podcaster based in the UK. Layla was based in the Arab world for several years, working as a journalist for international media outlets, including Reuters and CNN. And she has a special interest in social issues affecting Arabic-speaking communities, particularly in relation to culture, immigration, and mental health. Layla is now writing her first nonfiction book on her family's history of displacement across the Arab world over 100 years, and she is the creator and host of the Third Culture Therapy podcast, which explores mental health from a diverse cultural perspective. Welcome, Layla. So glad to have you on my podcast.
Thank you, Hadar. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Well, to be
So,
online with you.
yeah. We've had so many journeys together, I feel, over the last couple of years. And um, because my podcast is really in some ways centered around relational connections, I love to ask my guests, like, how did we first meet? And we have such a sweet story. So, yeah, would love for you to share a little bit about what it was like to first meet.
It is a sweet story. You're right. You and I met. I remember the scene very, very vividly. It was in the garden in the lawn of a mutual friend's house in the Cotswolds countryside of England at a Rumi festival. It was the inaugural Rumi festival, Rumi Fest, as it's called. And you were there dressed in all white, I recall, this flowy dress or skirt and top combo. I can't recall, but I just remember you had this very angelic look about you. And our friend had mentioned to me earlier, in the day that I should meet with you or that he wanted to introduce us, but it got really hectic and it was busy and there was a lot going on. There were whirling dervishes dancing, there were musicians singing, there was food. It was a beautiful, beautiful day, but so many things happened, and then he never got to do that introduction. But somehow we ended up sitting next to each other, and I turned to look at you and we started speaking, and I realized you were the Hadar that he'd been wanting to introduce me to. So in the end, what was meant to be happened, and we met, and then we spoke there, and that was it. It was a short conversation, but I think we both felt then that we was definitely something that we would have to find time to continue. And luckily, you came back to England a few months later, and then we really got to know each other much better.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, I love that you remember my outfit. I don't even remember it.
Just
Um,
goes to show that it was yeah, it was like I was meant to remember it, for this moment.
yeah. Yeah, and as you were describing it, it also feels like so ancient, like meeting at this garden with, like of the beyond time. But yeah, I definitely felt like sisterhood with you almost right away. Like I remember our conversation was just so, I don't even remember what we spoke about, but it was just like, yes, like politics, gender, spirituality, the intersection of all of that, which we will talk about more here together.
Yeah,
So you
absolutely.
do so much incredible work, and in some ways, a lot of it centers around your identity and your mixed identity. So I wanted to ask you to share a little bit about, yeah, who you are, your multiple kinds of Arabs.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
multiple kinds of Arab. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, so many ways to start this, but I was born and raised in London, England. So that's the sort of base, I guess, the bureaucratic base identity is British, and a Londoner. Um, and it's where I live now. But the mixed Arab part is from, on the one hand, my mother is Syrian, and from Damascus, and also Syria is a very big part of my life, experientially, because we used to, as a family, go and visit there every summer growing up. So I'd spend about 2.5 months of every year in Damascus and have the sort of closest ties, familial ties over there. And I also lived there for periods of time as an adult, um, when I was post-graduating, and also when I was freelancing as a journalist at the start of the Arab Spring and at the beginning of the during the beginning of the Syrian uprising. Then on my dad's side, it's a combination of Libyan and Palestinian. Libyan, being my grandparents who left Libya because of the Italian occupation in the early 1900s, and separately ended up making their way to Palestine. Um, my grandfather had been part of the resistance against the Italians, and then he joined the Ottoman forces and fought during World War One against the British in Haifa. My grandmother had also migrated to sort of flee the Italians and was in Lebanon, but then also ended up in Haifa. And then my father was born and raised in Haifa along with his siblings. He was born in the 30s and was a teenager, young teenager during the Nakba when they were refugeed to Syria. And that's also why the Syria connection and how my parents ended up meeting there. Um, so yeah, it's a mixed bag of identities in there.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, so much trauma and displacement and violence in so many different angles. So I imagine it's not easy to be you on one hand, but also in your activism. I know that you go to Syria, you've been to Libya, Palestine, and like all these different activism. So I'm curious, like how that all coalesces for you. Like, um, yeah, does it feel like you have to like focus on one part of your identity, or they're all very intersectional? Do they all inform one another? Are they sometimes in tensions with one another?
They definitely all inform one another. And yeah, it's interesting to be from different countries, but still have a unifying identifier of Arab. So I do like, um, that's why I present always in the shorthand first instance as British Arab, because I feel like it really does encapsulate in two words many different identities. Because even within the British, there's a United Kingdom that are separate territories and countries that are under a union. There's Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland rather. And so, but when you're saying British, it's a different, like I'm using the umbrella term. Um, the tensions between them exist insofar as people I find tend to like having one clear national identity. And me presenting multiple ones um, was difficult for me for a very long time growing up because I did crave the simplicity of just being able to say one country and then everything that comes with that, the ease with which you can become very patriotic or nationalistic, which is obviously very popular these days, and um, feeling like you have a clear sense of belonging and identity. And that was very difficult for me growing up because I felt that every answer to the question of where are you from was just so complex. And I didn't want to be complex at that age. I didn't appreciate complexity in the same way that now I do. But it was my own journey to reconciling that actually there doesn't need to exist tension between them. There is a harmony, and there's also a story of why this is the way that it is. The reason why I come from disparate places is because of continued displacement that occurred as a result of either colonization, violence, conflict, political activism. And so, I have to also honor, or not have to, I want to also honor that aspect of my identity. That is the reality of how I came to be here and from these places. There's a story to that. I think writing the book about my family history has helped me embrace all of the sides to me even more and feel like there is a reconciliation between them because there's a story within that. There's a strand linking it all. It doesn't just seem very like random. What's Libya got to do with Palestine? What's Syria? Where is that in the mix? So that's been really helpful for me personally. And then I think that's translated then to how I present. And I suppose in terms of my activism, um, related to all of them, my I th I think my primary form of, I suppose, the primary cause that I'm activated around now is Palestine. And I do think that is kind of central to all of the Arab world, actually. So I don't think there's tension between them either, because I think where Palestine goes, the rest follows. I also do think that to a certain extent, where Syria goes, the rest follows. But they're linked. They're interlinked, very much so. So no, I don't feel too much tension between that, thankfully.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I love that you're writing a book. Your voice is so important, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And yeah, I think about you as this intersection of all these identities because thinking about Palestine and Syria and Libya, these are places where the world often overlooks or misunderstands, and especially, of course, in the West. So, yeah, what does it mean to hold these identities and also be part of activism of, yeah, places that have, in some ways, this shared history and this shared resistance to empire and colonialism, but in some ways are very, um, yeah, like glossed over. I mean, especially Libya, but also Syria. When everything was happening this year in Syria, there's been so, I mean, and then of course Palestine, um, I guess I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit about that. And I know you travel also back and forth between these places and um, being in the UK and in the Western world and then going to the Arab world and how you navigate those complexities of like what it means
Mm,
to be an Arab in the UK speaking about all of this work
mm.
and what does it mean being back in the various homelands that you're from and engaging in the work and how you balance it all.
Yeah. Um, yeah, to your point of people not being aware of a lot of the history and the nuances and layers, I definitely feel that. I mean, I feel that across the board, but really acutely with Libya, for example, because yeah, the history of Libya is not really very well known pre-Gaddafi. And I would argue that to understand how and why someone like Gaddafi was able to have such a violent hold over the country, you actually do need to look at what happened before that, and that was the very brutal colonization by the Italians of Libya for a little over 30 years. And during that time, 30 some years, they completely decimated the local population, like up around the quarter, 25 to 30% of the local population was killed, either through forced like mass starvation campaigns or bombing or being exiled, forced exile. But the first so one of the first concentration camps erected by Europeans was in Libya, and in fact went on to inspire. I use inspire a very yeah negatively in this context. The Nazis later when they built their concentration camps in Germany. But if you ask anybody, almost anybody, hey, do you know that this is what happened to Libya by the Italians? They'd have absolutely no idea. It's just not part of the general awareness, which is really shocking. Like Why isn't it? It's a huge deal. This is a really big, like not only did they kill, mass murder local population, but also local livestock. So we're talking like hundreds of thousands of sheep because it was a Bedouin culture, and that was also part of their way of trying to subjugate the Libyans and get the territories under their control. And so you think, God, that's what they endured. And then there was independence post World War II for under a monarchy for not very long, just a little over a decade, and then you had this military coup. Um, so there's been no time really for Libya and Libyans to go through a processing, a grieving, and a recognizing of the horrific trauma that was inflicted on them. And on top of that, there hasn't been proper recognition by Europe or other Western historians. I mean, not to say that this hasn't been written about, it has, but not widely enough. There's still a sort of purposeful amnesia that occurs. And in Italy, they don't, it's not discussed. It's not part of the national consciousness to have that sort of reckoning and look at what they've done in their history. There's been a lot of sweeping it under the carpet, and even national archives on that period remain, off limits for in part. So I found that really stunning. And the more I researched and found out then about my own family history and understood this more of the specifics of why they left and what was happening, I was really, taken aback to realize, gosh, the how far back the pain inflicted by colonialism goes. Because I grew up very aware that my father was refugeed in 1948 by Zionist forces, and grew up throughout my life, with yeah, very very like very well informed and about the Palestinian cause and Palestinian resistance and occupation, but a little less so about Libya's history. Like I knew, but not the details in the same way. So yeah, then going back and realizing, gosh, actually the wounds go even further back. Was I want to say, I feel like saying interesting doesn't really quite cut it, but yeah, it was a revelation. It was very much a revelation, but also showing me the interlinkedness of these of oppression and of oppressed people in the same way that the links between oppressors exist. And so, for example, my grandfather's story really sort of exemplifies this. He was part of the local resistance, the Libyan resistance against the Italian occupation. But when he was then condemned to death and he had to flee, he joined the Ottomans to fight against the British. And in World War One, and although they lost in the end, and he did stay in Haifa, he then falls under British occupation. So he's just like tried to flee one European occupation, and then it's like there's another one over here. And meanwhile, the people he had joined in the resistance or had joined him in the resistance in Libya had also like joined again, taken their resistance movement to Palestine, and were still working on it there. So again, seeing the interconnectivity of those people who have been for decades and centuries fighting for the rights of oppressed people over, and then it has also shown me again the lineage, like the lineage and the tracing back how far that goes in my personal history, family history, but also at large. Um, that kind of is in stark contrast with then being a born and raised British person, Londoner. It is challenging in many ways, emotionally, to reconcile how my life and a relatively privileged one at that, growing up in a country like England, has is the result of actually a lot of pain and trauma created by the same people that I'm now, again, part and parcel of. So it is challenging, and it's become more so in the last couple of years with with what's happening in Gaza and the genocide, and then the crackdown by politicians and police against protesters and activists or generally Palestinian sympathizers. It's a tension though that needs to be addressed, I think. I think in some ways it's always been there, but I was able to maybe ignore it, but now I can't. And there's a lot of relief that comes in a way from that, though.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. I'm curious to hear a little bit, if we're staying on the topic of Libya, like because you went to Libya in the last year, and you had a really powerful journey there. So I'm curious to hear more about what it was like to be there. And
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, so I've been actually a couple of times in the past year. I went almost a year apart from each other. The first time I went last year in 2024. I went for a month, and that was sort of yeah, I hadn't been in over 10 years, and we had some family matters to attend to, and I took it as an opportunity to go and deal with that, but stay longer and do some research for the book. So that research meant essentially trying to track down as many living relatives as I could and try and find out, as much about my grandparents and great grandparents' stories as I could. And that took me to Kikla, which is a mountainous region outside of Tripoli, about a couple of hours drive, in this small village, which is where my grandfather and great grandfather and basically the whole tribe from my grandfather and earlier were from. And I got to see the sort of life that they lived 100 years ago. Very, very, gosh, so incredibly different from my own life that sometimes I'm like, wow, I can't believe it's only a couple of generations between us. But yes, a small village where they lived in these stone houses, which I went to the site of it, and it was basically in pieces. Like the bit of the structure remained. A lot of stones had been sort of people had taken from them to kind of use for their own homes, and then but they were otherwise like Bedouins who had land, and they grew olives and barley on there, which is mostly what you grow in Tripoli, olive and barley and a few other grains. And yeah, it was a kind of simple site, yes, Bedouin experience. Not fully Bedouin in the sense that they weren't roaming, but like it was, my grandfather had what I call a man cave carved into the side of the mountain when he would be going to do the harvest. Like that's where he would sleep because it's obviously it was a bit of a trip away from the actual town. And instead of going back and forth, he would just sleep there. And so I went into this cave and saw it. It's like only sort of 2.5 meters high, and it's dug in. Obviously, you can tell it's been dug by hand. And there was just what would have been, I think, some hay placed on there, and just to make sort of a bedding situation, and that's where they'd sleep. And that was kind of their life. And then everything changed when there was the occupation, and what before was this simple spiritual life that my grandfather had because he was also a Sufi, and was completely upended, and he decided to go down the mountain and like join the resistance, like most of the local men did at the time. And that then ended up taking him thousands of miles away from home and in exile for like most of his life. Um, so it was really fascinating to see how far my family have gone, and in I guess in a short space of time, but also how differently my life is from theirs. And um I'm not sure with what feeling that's left with me with right now. Just it's just very it's just very interesting. I think I'm still figuring out. It's nice to learn about your family, but it's also a little bit strange to feel so different from it.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, I'm not sure if I've really answered that, but oh, so you were asking, yes, more about the Libya trip itself. So that was where I saw my grandfather's village, and got to experience more of the landscape of Libya, which is very different to um, when I go to Damascus. Like in Libya, it's a lot more deserty. The aesthetic is a lot more beige colored, let's say. Um, and it's more tribal just in its way of being, although it's things that it's different now, but you can still tell that relationally there's a lot there based on who you know, and people are very cliquey in that way. It's just more of a tribal culture. Um, and then went to track down my grandmother's roots, and she was from the city of Misrata, which is the other large city in Libya. And I tried, but failed, unfortunately, to find any living family members. But that was a fun. That was an. It was just a kind of a humorous trip in trying to wing it. In modern day sort of, I don't know, sleuthing. But basically, I just went with a couple of local Libyans down to the city, and we just were trying to ask around, and literally asked everyone we could meet. Do you know this person? Have you heard of this person? This name, that name. I'd heard through a cousin that my my one of my uncles who's not alive anymore, used to go to a house that was near like an old olive press and near like these two distinctive palm trees. And so we were literally trying to find a house based on like those very random bits of information, and just like going around into alleyways and like asking this and that. Unfortunately, we didn't get anywhere, but it was kind of fun and amusing to try and track down her where the older family history. But one thing that was kind of cute that happened was we did ask the local police, like we stopped at the local police station, and then there were these men outside, so we just asked him, oh, do you know so and so? And then he was like, oh, do you mean the mother of the and I said, I'm the daughter of Dr. Mahmoud Maghribi, and he was like, oh, do you mean the Palestinian? And then the guy next to him was like, no, you idiot, he was Libyan. And I was like, that's so funny. This is the story, like the story of my dad's life, and the story again of my life. It was like, where are you actually from? Because they recognized his name because of my dad's position in politics in Libya, and because he had been prime minister. So, and because Misrata is small enough that, again, back to that whole tribal thing, like people are going to know if someone prominent came from there. So they recognized this, but they were like confused about where is he from? And I was like, oh, it still endures to this day, like this question of where are you from? Um, but yeah, sorry,
That's
I
so
think I might have
beautiful.
gone off piste.
I hope that makes it into the book, 'cause that's really
It does make it into the book.
yeah. Yeah, your grandfather seems like such a special person. I mean, I love that he was a Sufi who also joined the resistance, and um yeah, and the ways in which, fighting the Italians in Libya is parallel to fighting the British in Palestine. And, in some ways, all of these different Arab countries have distinct histories, but there's also a shared resistance to Western imperialism and colonialism. And um, yeah, I find that to be really powerful, that in some ways he was like moving between these worlds. And I also love that you did like this ancestral pilgrimage, because, oftentimes in the Western world, when we talk about politics, it can get very intellectualized and we can forget the texture of the land or the people and what's left. And I find that there can be a gap. And I find that you actually bridge that gap with so much of your activism and your work of like going home, returning to the West, writing, speaking, and kind of navigating all of that. So I wanted to ask you, earlier you said that Palestine is in some ways the key to
Mm.
understanding the larger context of the Arab world.
Mm.
or, and Syria as well. So, yeah, I'm curious to just hear a little bit about what you mean by that.
I suppose the very simplistic answer is in the same way we say, none of us are free until Palestine is free. It's just that on a more concentrated level when you are from the Middle East or the Arab world, because in truth, none of the countries in that region will be able to find peace and prosperity, long-lasting peace and prosperity until the Palestine question is resolved. So, whereas you can try and resolve the others, and this is often what they've been trying to do, actually, since 1940, since even maybe before, arguably, but since 1948, especially since the 1970s onwards, what you'll find is this policy generally in the Western world to try and resolve all the other problems except Palestine, and unsurprisingly, with little to no success, because again, it really just comes back. You cannot solve any of the other issues until you solve this one. It's a classic kind of divide and conquer strategy, and then, well, it's divide, conquer, and then pacify. So when you try and do these separate peace deals with other countries or try and resolve other countries, you think that isolates more and more the biggest problem, right, the Palestinians, and therefore renders them weak enough to then become um, irrelevant. But what time has shown is that it doesn't work. It will always come back to the central issue of Palestine, and that is for a variety of reasons. Very, very basically, practically speaking, the neighboring countries, they have a huge Palestinian population, mostly in the form of refugees, um, that is problematic again for domestic politics nationally in one way or another, whether it's because financially, whether it's because demographically, whether it's because of resistance, operating within their lands that they don't want to. So politically, there are many, many reasons just for why that's problematic. But on a wider level, it's just the fact of the matter is, and I think this goes to the heart of maybe perhaps people's understanding and perception of Palestine and Israel, is that why is Israel actually there? And yes, sure, there is the Zionist element of and belief in this chosen people, chosen land narrative. But if you don't subscribe to that, which I don't, or anti-Zionist Jews don't, or anyone against Palestinian occupation and apartheid isn't, then you understand it in a different light, which is this is a Western, primarily American settler colony placed in the heart, in the middle of Arab lands and territory, a region, to create disunity, discord among people who, without that, would actually have a probably very, very flourishing and a unified political, social, and economic system that is not beholden to aid or to the IMF or to the World Bank or to American foreign policy. So when you look at it like that, that's why I see it as a central key, and because the whole element, everything around Palestine is not just about the liberation of Palestine for Palestinians. It's about the liberation of all oppressed peoples from the neo-imperialism that is has been launched by Western world basically in the last since Cold War, even earlier, even before. But you know, so this is where we have to, I think, look at the cause as more than just I mean, the people who are there who still remain the priority, because you always want to try and save the lives of the people who are living now, but it's a much bigger issue.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting, because I was just in El Andalus and we spoke a lot about how the conquest of El Andalus is still reverberating today, in that pattern,
Mm,
where the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain and the colonization of the Americas and the slave trade and all of these um, incredibly destructive ways of being in this universe. Like we're still in this era of colonialism and imperialism that in some ways really originated there. And Palestine is in some ways a continuation of that.
yeah, we are definitely in the I would say we're in this post-colonial colonial era, post-colonial imperial era. It's tricky because it just I think post-World War II, the sense of post-colonialism was very, it was a very euphoric, liberatory feeling. But I think what happened is, so I think what happened is that it just got repackaged in a different manner,
Mm.
and we are suffering the consequences of that today. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you said, something interesting about the kind of Zionist fantasy about Jews and chosen people, and um, actually that's really not what's going on, but it's really more about like this kind of heart of imperialism. But I always find it so strange around how well that tactic works, and in some ways, especially in Europe, where there's so much guilt around um, yeah, what was done to Jewish people there. So this kind of using of Jewish people, and saying that it's about the safety of Jews when it's really not, right? Because when Jews are pro-Palestine, they also get attacked. So it's not actually about the safety of Jewish people. It's actually the
Yeah.
safety of a nation state entity. Um,
Yes.
but yeah,
Yes.
I'm curious to ask you because I know like also befriending Jewish people has been something that has been in your world in the last couple of years. And um, yeah, like what does it mean to kind of dismantle this narrative, this Zionist narrative that like what we're fighting is like this Jewish chosenness when really it is the colonialism and imperialism, and what does it mean to be in relationship with Jewish people in this time? And
Yeah.
yeah.
It's been fascinating, and this is I'm yeah in awe at the universe and God's like form of sending messages and healing. Um, the development of relationships with Jewish people in the past 2 years at a time when you could understandably think that the complete opposite would happen, right? There would be more of this like tension and schism. Um, but what happened is we found each other because I guess we needed to, because we were aligned on the same values, and it became actually a form of healing because it actually became more clarifying to me that it isn't about Judaism. It's actually about Zionism. And while there is all of this massive effort being put towards conflating the two, I mean, it just isn't true. So the fact is, one is a faith and a spirituality, the other is more of a political ideology. But I think having those experiences, like, with you and with a few other people who I met in the last couple of years, I suppose because we met also, we met because of Palestine. So we met because, I don't know, events or talks or social media or whatever led us to one another. So it was um it was already safe in a way. It felt like we didn't have to have that awkward beginning conversation where you're trying to find out like where do you stand, and which is probably why in there before that I didn't have that many Jewish friends, because for the most part I was like, I don't know, are we gonna get into one? I don't really want to get into one. I don't want to get upset. So maybe let's not even. I mean, it's also just a bit circumstantially and socially the circle that I was in. But then, having found each other, I was also just struck by how much similarity there was in thinking and oftentimes even in ancestral experience. because Jewish people who are pro-Palestinian have drawn those same links as I have, which is drawn the links between their own historic oppression and the oppression that is happening today. Just because it so happens that it's being done, it's supposedly to protect Jews now, doesn't mean that it's any less nefarious. And as you rightly just pointed out, if you're Jewish, it's not actually about you being protected because you're Jewish now. It's about you're only being protected if you're a Zionist Jew. If you're an anti-Zionist Jew, you're going to get your face smashed in, as we saw the bloody pictures of that woman in New York yesterday. So sorry for the listeners. Well, not yesterday, it will be whenever it is you listen to this, but in late April. So yeah, my where was I going with that? Sorry. Um
Yeah, that it's not like about protecting Jewish people.
Yeah, so what I mean to say is that we're aligning on values, we're aligning on shared history, and we're aligning on the deep understanding, the visceral understanding that our fates are very interlinked. So in some ways, what was even more fascinating was that the depth of relationship was almost deeper um, than with, or I was able to get to a deeper place with some. Let me repeat that. Sorry. What was fascinating was we were able to reach a depth of relationship often with my new Jewish friends because of all of this reflection that had happened, maybe more so than people who didn't come from either background, but I'd known for longer, or who might even intellectually know more. Um, because I think, oppressed people and demonized people, like we know, we understand. We get what's happening here. And I think for really clued up and aware Jewish people, I think they are also seeing the trap that is being laid out. And they're very, yeah, cognizant of that. And so, because I also see it in the same way, we're able to connect on a way that's a lot more, yeah, a lot more understanding, a lot more depth, and oddly, just like a lot more trusting. Because I really feel like there's a core understanding of what this is actually genuinely about.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. And it almost feels like this kind of somatic knowledge. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
which leads me to my next question, which is all about mental health and all the work that you do around that. So you have a podcast, but you're
Mm,
also very invested in, I would say, like your own mental health and the mental health of your community. And
yeah.
yeah, curious to hear you speak about the intersections of engaging with mental health work and political activism and um,
Mm.
how you see that connection.
Yeah. So political activism runs in my like DNA. As I said, I'd mentioned that my grandfather was part of the resistance against the Italians, but my father was also, from a young age, part of many resistance movements, but primarily the Palestinian and the Libyan. So from when he was a young boy in Haifa, he used to, even against like, try and fight British occupation and the Zionist forces that pre-48 were still launching a lot of attacks on Arab districts. And he used to, like, as a young kid, like try and follow like suspected spies and like knock out the lights of the street lights for where British troops would do patrols. I mean, this was like his early days, childhood activism. But it really grew in earnest from his days as a student in Syria, first when he formed something called the Children of Palestine movement, what he co-founded, sorry, and then afterwards in Libya, this was much later. He in the 60s, he moved to Libya and was working there in 1967 when the war broke out, and he was a lawyer for an oil company and also part of the oil workers union, and he led a series of protest movements to compel the Libyan government to boycott and to stop like an embargo of sales of oil to Israeli allies. And that got him sent to prison, unfortunately, as a consequence, because he'd sort of embarrassed the king at the time. And he was there for 2 years before he was then released. And then he was invited to join the First Republic government after the 1969 coup, and was the first prime minister of Libya before then later going into opposition in the mid 70s and starting his own opposition movement in exile in the UK. So the history of activism and resistance to authoritarian figures or occupation or to oppression is definitely well entrenched in me. And I grew up very aware of all of that and had in mind that that I would be some sort of like Joan of Arc figure in the future and try and lead the charge of liberating the oppressed people everywhere, but definitely in the Arab world, like. But obviously, it's more than a one-woman job. I think that's also partly why I went into journalism, because I wanted to be able to tell the stories, to be able to spotlight what I felt was important, to be able to be a bridge, having, leveraging my privilege as a British-born Arab who could straddle these worlds. I felt like that was kind of the cause I could take on and put out there in the world. And to a certain extent, I think that was true. But also, unfortunately, I felt increasingly like that wasn't enough. I also felt, as has kind of really been proven in the last couple of years, that media journalism, there were some question marks around its own ethics and formulation of narratives, especially when it came to Muslims and Arabs. And so I was sort of falling out of love with the profession. And then, yeah, and then I think it really kind of hit me after the Palestinian journalist, the veteran journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered essentially by Israeli forces when she was covering one of their incursions into Jenin, I believe it was at the time. And I was so horrified by the lack of, I mean, there was a huge public outpouring, but a lack of accountability, political accountability, official accountability. And it was really, really depressing. And this is when I started to think that actually, we need to create our own platforms and narratives and be able to express truly how we feel as Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, pro-Palestinians. And it also was coinciding at a time when I was looking in my own family history and had also made the connections between some of the mental health struggles I had faced and what had happened in my family. So essentially looking into the intergenerational trauma of things. And because it took me a while to understand why I felt certain ways about things, even though I hadn't necessarily experienced something particularly negative or awful in my upbringing. But it was because also a lot of displacement brings with it anxiety and fears and dislocation and rupture from parents who are raising their children, right? So obviously that was, even if you're not talking about what gets passed through your DNA, even experientially, like from the parent-child relationship, there will be some of that passed on. But certainly also physiologically, there's increasingly evidence that that does get transmitted. So all of these things were coalescing at the same time, and I had been fortunate enough to give myself the time to explore my own feelings around that and go to therapy and try other alternative medicines. And I'd also gone through a bit of a period where, as a result of accumulation of things over the years of being a journalist and traveling around and witnessing also Syria and the war was really, really brutal on me personally. And we had yeah, there was stuff that happened in my family in Syria that was really painful, and just feeling like I'd lost this other country as well as all of the others that I'd lost in my history. So I did get to a point where I struggled with my own mental and emotional well-being, and but I was fortunate enough to be able to seek and find help and go on a journey with that. When I came out of it, I suppose, when I felt much better and much stronger for it, one of the things that I really resolved to do is to talk more about it and to try and make it more accessible and open for others. Because I really saw that there was a huge gap in that regard, and that not just amongst Arabs, but I can just speak for sort of my peoples, if I will, in this instance, that there's a lot aside from just there being a lot of stigma surrounding mental health still, but really it's this this famed resilience of ours. Like they're always talking about how resilient we are. But the problem with the resilience part is you become really normalized to the despair and the difficulties and the tragedies around you, and not necessarily really understanding how much it's impacting you in your day to day. And I was just looking around and seeing all of these walking wounded people who just really didn't have even like the awareness or probably not even the moment to actually give themselves a moment of awareness of like how all of this stuff is interlinked. How, having your grandparents being, exiled from their house at gunpoint will bring out feelings of depression for you, growing up in whatever New York or London, and you don't necessarily know why. But actually, there is like you can trace it back. You can see not just physiologically, but like all of the things that you have lost along the way. Um, and um, and so I wanted that to be my sort of the conversation to have and to put out into the world and to encourage others to have those conversations. And more importantly, to offer people a variety of means to exploring it so that it wasn't just from a Western Eurocentric lens. I'm a big fan of therapy. I think talk therapy is great, but it's definitely not the only way, and it's certainly not necessarily the best first way for certain people to approach their mental and emotional well-being. And culturally, all cultures around the world have their own ways, have had their own ways for centuries of dealing with emotional mental regulation. But it's been either eradicated or hidden or ignored by Western psychology for the past 100 years when Western psychology really came to the fore. So I kind of wanted to work at dismantling that and giving people again their own voice and their own experiences validity, be that both in the quote unquote positive or negative, i.e., your concerns are unique and valid and legitimate, but also your ways of dealing it from your own culture and heritage are also equally valid and legitimate. And so let's try and see if we can bring those out more.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a friend recently said about how colonialism really thrives when we don't know how we feel. And there's like a certain interest of us being disoriented in our emotional body because it makes
Mm,
us like easier to fall into the system. And I've just been
yep.
thinking about that a lot. Because I mean, I think especially with Palestinians, but not just Palestinians, with Arabs and a lot of people from the global south, like when they tell their stories in the media, there's like so much control of their emotions. Like you can't be too angry and you can't express joy at this thing, or you really have to keep yourself very collected in a very specific way to be
Hmm.
able to communicate whatever it is that you want to communicate. And yeah, just really thinking about the cost of that to people's life. And for me, part of, the fight for Palestinian liberation is also like that Palestinians just get to be human, with like so many emotions and so like and there's no expectation that they all be one way or feel one way or and um yeah, I don't know, it just made me think a lot about this is like a whole other conversation, but just how like the aliveness of people, and especially of Arabs and Palestinians, like is such a threat to the Western world. Like, like the
Mm-hmm.
traditions of joy, because there's so much in it. You talked about resilience, but there's also so much, um, yeah, like culture and traditions and beauty and richness that's like passed on
Hmm.
despite all the horrors.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's something so powerful there that I think is such a threat, because, and this is in some ways true of all colonial struggles, that like the colonized people have something that the colonizer wants and can't
Yeah.
have,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's funny. Yes, someone's literally said that as well. We were talking about it just the other day about the idea of um she was describing colonizers going to colonized countries and them witness like the going and seeing such a like abundance of giving and community, and because they come from this starving scarcity mindset, they just go and want to like grab everything and just like just greedily gobble everything up, and then that sort of destroys what they originally coveted, because you cannot just you can't um manufacture community, and you can't just take it over. um, Community is something built from within, and is, I think, the ultimate test of sincerity, like sincere giving, because you do it because you believe in a community. Otherwise, if it's just a case of give and take, you can do that through business dealings, that you'll still maybe get the same end result, but it won't have the same taste or flavor, and it may not last as long. But community, and I think this is goes back to what you said a little bit earlier, how much living there is among Palestinians and among Arabs at large. And that's in large part because of community. There's so much a lot like their biggest social capital is the community that they're in and a part of. And there's this awareness and understanding that we um, live together and for one another, and the saddest thing you witness is often in times of conflict and extreme violence is that breakdown of community. And I saw that to a certain extent in during the Syrian war. And yeah, I was just literally on the phone with someone from Gaza just before we got on here, and um he was talking about the financial difficulties he's in and how it's very difficult to get food, etc., for him and his family. And he mentioned, he's like, now like the nobody cares about anybody else anymore here because everything's just so bad. Everybody's just taking care of themselves. And there's like no surplus to give to anybody. And like if there is, they'll like sell it on the black market to try and get more from. He was just describing this like breakdown of community, which Gaza is, in particular, is incredibly famous for. I mean, like they are around the whole region, but and I just thought again about how much that is a weapon of war, and how purposefully that is purposefully done, because that is the most powerful thing they have. And when you do cut off food and aid coming in for weeks on end, that that's exactly what's going to happen, that people will, out of desperation, become increasingly selfish and isolated, and maybe even turn on each other. Like it's very much that's part of the plan. And just goes to show, therefore, how powerful it is, right? To go to such extreme lengths, like extreme violence, in order to break down that spirit, that community. It just goes, yeah, that's
Yeah.
why we have to protect it. Yeah, absolutely, at all costs. But it's challenging for sure.
Yeah, definitely. You're making me think of how, Palestine pre-48, like people, and still in some villages, right? Like they don't lock their doors. It wasn't, you just like left your, and my grandma, who's from Jerusalem for many generations, like till the day she died. She would just like never lock her door, because he was just like, yeah, we live in a community and like if someone wants to come in, they're welcome. And, sadly, in some ways, that kind of community culture is also what allowed for the colonization to kind of take place because there was so much actually welcoming, which I think is something that is often not talked about, right? Is that when the US shut its doors to Jews, like Palestine
Yep.
actually welcomed Jews to,
Yeah,
um,
it's true. And it's worrying because I get scared that the conclusion of that is going to be, well, then never open your door to anybody again, which is like not what we want as the conclusion,
yeah,
obviously. But the problem is that we have not yet seen enough accountability and punishment of the opposite.
yeah,
And until that record is set straight, and I think this is what this whole movement really is about. It's really trying to globally upend the system that has been the system that we've been living under all our lives and even before then for decades. But the system of hegemonic powers trying to break apart and commercialize everything of existence
mhm,
to the point of, I mean, essentially, if you take it that to its logical conclusion, it will render everything about that makes humans and humanity meaningful, like pointless.
yeah,
Um, but that's the overarching system that we're living on. It's under. It's not just a one country problem. It's a global one. Um, but we are still in that system. So until we are out of it, it's going to be a challenge. But I think you'll notice already within cultures how those who have adopted that approach are also now suffering. So whilst in the Western world, they have obviously benefited massively from the colonial exploits of their predecessors and of their current political systems in in many cases. It doesn't, beyond the material benefit, they're not necessarily spiritually, mentally, emotionally better off. In fact, I think probably peaked in that regard maybe sometime in the 80s or 90s, but even then, again, one could argue for a very specific cohort of people. But now, I mean, we know globally that there is a mental health epidemic, that young people are like the least happy they've ever been. And for the first time ever, I see less promise in their future than their predecessors did. I mean, all of these show you that just material development, just pure material progress and development and gain does not translate to better living.
yeah,
So I hope eventually we get to this awareness collectively, globally, of really the interlinkedness of all of it. Um, because they tried that way in the West. They tried the way of like, let me just think about myself and not be thinking about others, and let me just be like me and my immediate little nuclear family. And yeah, I don't think it's going that great.
yeah, yeah. As someone who's in
Um,
New York now, it's not going good at all. I mean, you
yeah,
see it, right? Like you see it walking, especially in the US, like people. Yeah, there's like a palpable feeling that there's a lot of unwellness inside in people's minds and in people's hearts. And, I think that's for me why I'm so invested in spirituality because it's kind of the doorway to this internal world or into the unseen world or the things that we don't talk about, but in some ways are creating our realities as well. So,
yeah,
yeah, I think
yeah,
that work that you do about intergenerational trauma and like getting people to reclaim their stories and tell it from their own perspectives and from their own emotions and from their own thoughts and to, it's really complex work, especially when you're colonized to like dissect like what is mine, what has been put on me, like now I have to constantly relate to the thing that is stereotyping me and
yeah.
it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. It's true. It's true. It is a lot of work. It is, but I think your point of reclaiming stories and narratives has been for me the strongest um power, I guess, that I feel like I've been cultivating,
Hmm.
which is really owning much more my voice and trying to encourage others to do the same. I think for a very long time, maybe it was a bit the immigrant mentality, minority mentality. I think I felt that I needed to strive for perfection and like do amazing things, and that everything needed to be top before it could go out into the world, as opposed to recognizing the value of just speaking and being heard, even in its raw and unpolished version. Like, obviously, we'll work to try and do our best in this and that, but sometimes it's not about that. It's just about repeatedly saying, like, here I am, this is who I am, this is what I think, this is what I feel, like, unapologetically, which, again, going back to the colonize decolonize mindset, is you feel that happens more the more you decolonize your mindset. You're less asking then for permission and, hey, can you please score this, this speech that I might give and tell me if it's good enough to say. It's no longer am I asking for that legitimacy, because now I brought it back to, wait, I am legitimate. So therefore what I'm saying should in and of itself be like, I'm actually talking about my family history. Like, why should that being in question or controversial in any way? But yeah, Palestine in the past couple of years has definitely brought me back to that. I feel like she did set me free in many ways, from maybe uh, it might have been an unlocked cage, but I think I was in a bit of a cage, before. Maybe I had the key, but I didn't really quite fully realize. And then I feel like Gaza and Palestine sort of just smashed the door open. I was like, oh, yeah, there was a door. I didn't even realize, actually, I totally need to like step into my full being and power, and not fear the consequences. Um, yeah, so that's what I try now to do in most of my work, whether it's writing, whether it's the podcast, whether, because I sometimes perform spoken words, especially for at Palestine fundraisers or events. And yeah, it's no longer, it's like all of the things that used to maybe hold me back or make me feel a bit scared before, like, should I, can I, would I, should I? And now it's just totally like, actually, no, just go fully in. Um, so I'm grateful. I'm grateful very much to be in this place now. Of course, I wish it wasn't off the back of so much suffering and tragedy, but I do feel like this has been the lesson I and many, many people that I know have learned in the last couple of years, is that shrinking does not get you anywhere. Be that on your micro level within your relationships with people, with your boss, or on a global, political scale. Like, trying to shrink yourself, we will never, it's never going to be enough for the other side who wants to actually eradicate you. So you may as well actually show up completely.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I love that. Especially because then
Mm.
if we repress parts of us, we're gonna end up also exploding, you know,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah,
which we do
exactly.
well. So,
We need it
oh,
every so often.
yeah. Um, well, okay, we talked a lot about Palestine and Libya, but I do want to touch a little bit about Syria because that also
Yeah.
seems really important.
Hmm. And I'm
Um,
going in a couple of days, so
and you're
you
going in
can
a
get
couple
me ready for going.
of Yeah, well, I don't even know where to start even asking you, but you traveled to Syria right after the fall of the Assad regime and in a
Did.
time where there was so much um opinions people were having about what's happening
Mm,
in Syria and yeah, I'm curious what that was like to go and what is it like to feel Syria post-Assad on the ground and um yeah.
yeah. I mean, first of all, it was incredible to go. It was the whole that whole period of the fall of the regime, that happened so quickly and unexpectedly at that time. I say at that time because I fully expected the regime to fall. I just, like most people, didn't think it was going to be then. Um, to go and witness in the media aftermath was a real privilege, a real privilege, because I know that a lot of Syrians would have loved to have gone then and couldn't for a variety of reasons. So I felt incredibly honored to be able to take that trip and to just be going purely for, like, I just want to be there. Felt amazing. Um, and it was amazing on the ground. It was, we also went, it was like New Year's Eve when I arrived. So there was already like the air of celebration and atmosphere of, new dawn and new era. And then you have it with a new year. So it was really beautiful and very magnificent. And I was hanging out with a bunch of Syrians who, many of them who, like me, lived abroad but had come back. And so we had a really fun time and singing revolutionary songs and then going out into the streets and doing that. And then just walking around and speaking with people. And there were a lot of areas in Damascus that had previously been closed off to the public, especially like in the mountains, because there are the famous Mount Qasyun, which surrounds Damascus, and that had been closed off for many years for Syrians. It used to be like a sort of very popular hangout spot because it overlooks the whole city, and it's nice sort of fresh air up there, but you also have a beautiful view, and these tea and coffee places would sprout up and shacks, and or people would get there like snacks and tea and just sit there for hours. And so suddenly all of these people were going like waves and waves and waves of people. There was like huge traffic jams up and down the mountain. It was quite hilarious, but it was euphoric, right? It was like, wow, that's something so momentous. But even then, I did notice there were some faces and conversations that were talking about their fears and their trepidation about HTS, which had been formerly affiliated with Al Qaeda in its previous iterations, and the fear of there being some sort of fundamentalist Islamic group maybe taking over, and then certain people who had been pro-regime were now obviously afraid for their own, interests and safety now. And so I was aware that there was some of that. And now I would say there's probably more of that because we're 4 or 5 months from that point of time, and a few things have happened politically and on the ground domestically that have heightened some fears in one direction. So I'm talking about, for example, the massacres that happened on the coastal region. But then also in the other direction, the formation of a government, the inclusion of women in certain positions, central bank, and other portfolios, and the foreign ministers like fairly successful sort of travels around and around the globe, and different sounds being made across from the UN and the EU, and lifting of sanctions by certain countries, including the UK, have all sort of also pointed in a direction that's like, okay, actually, there's potential and for real positive developments on the ground. I'm really curious now to go and see what I see for myself, because even with some of the people I've spoken with, there's been mixed bag of reactions ranging from it's terrible to it's amazing. So I need to go now and see for myself who is saying that and why. Um, I would say materially, though, on the ground, it's very, very challenging. It's that people are in desperate financial difficulty, poverty levels, unemployment levels, prices have, just really increased a lot. And the day-to-day living is painful. It's painful, and in large part because of a destructive war, but also because of sanctions. So I think people still have this general hopefulness towards the future of the country, but it is being every day sort of tempered by the fact that materially life remains hard. I personally feel fairly positive about the long term future of Syria. Even the short term, depending a little bit on certain what happens materially again, like how much investment they're going to be able to get into the country in a short space of time. But for the most part, I feel that Syria has a lot that it is capable. Syria and Syrians have a lot that they're capable of achieving. And I think in the unity of vision, and if the surrounding countries do genuinely want to help, and if there is genuine interest from EU, UK, and other Western governments to facilitate reconstruction, that we can get somewhere fairly decent in a short space of time. That doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that we are going to have a ideal political scenario. Um, and by that, I mean, I don't necessarily know, I don't know, obviously none of us know, but I don't necessarily think that we're looking ahead to a multi-party, fully democratically elected government in the near future. Um, some people would take issue with me being okay with that. And I understand. And this isn't because I fancy Ahmed al-Sharia, but it is because I'm just, at least in my mind, being a bit pragmatic as to the realities of the situation on the ground. And that's a country that has been under one family's iron grip for 54 years, a very repressive one at that, after 13 years of a brutal and bloody war in which half the population was either displaced internally or exiled, essentially exiled, refugeed, or killed or disappeared. So we're talking that's like 12, 13 million people. Um, and the the infrastructure of the country is completely decimated, completely. Like everything is gone. Everything needs to be rebuilt, from roads to electricity lines to schools to bakeries to hospitals. I mean, everything. So I think it's very challenging. And then also, not to mention, you have an entire generation of children who have not, many hundreds of thousands who haven't gone to school, who basic literacy levels aren't there. I mean, there's so many challenges to overcome that I think we struggle to also incorporate within that, going from dictatorial, repressive family regime to fully fledged multi-party democracy of the kind that requires an educated and engaged society, a politically engaged society, right? Otherwise, it's just not a real democratic process. So that's what I think. But I know some people don't like that I kind of almost reconciled myself with that. Maybe I don't think it's because I'm setting the bar low. It's just because I think we need certain things to happen first in Syria. And I think I would be all right with, us rebuilding the country and getting it back on its feet more than trying right now to push massively for a yeah, a fully fledged democracy right now. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop working towards it. I just think this
Yeah.
is what I envision, where I envision in the immediate we're going. I also hope that there'll remain the degree of activism that has emerged from inside and outside Syria among Syrians, and the civil society movements that were incredibly active during the war, but even more so now, post fall of the Assad regime, and many of whom these groups have plugged a lot of the gaps that the governments, both the former and the present, haven't been able to fill. And I would love, and I'm really hopeful that that continues to flourish and to provide an opportunity in which people can rebuild and repair the country in community and among each other. I believe a lot more in that um, than anything else. And I
Mm.
believe in the power of people to be able to come together and create beautiful things, and for it to serve multiple purposes in doing so. And what I've witnessed has been, yeah, really inspiring. So I'm really looking forward to going and seeing what new is happening and what other initiatives have developed and emerged. But I've attended a few conferences already from different civil society groups that have come together, and it's been really quite impressive to see what they've managed to already do in a short space of time.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, I remember right after the fall of the regime, it was so beautiful to see so many different Syrians like contribute what they could. And I don't even mean just financially, but they're just like, okay, well, I want to go back and I want to start this center or this, and just that energy was really moving for me. And you're making me think of a few years ago. This was like 5 years ago. I remember I told people that like my dream was to, when I'm older, to spend like the last days of my life in Syria, because my family's Syrian Jewish. And this was mostly in Jewish community, and they like looked at me and they were like, "What? Like, no way is that ever going to be possible?" And uh,
Oh, you never know.
yeah, you never know, and you never know when regimes fall and what possibilities and potentialities are there. And um, yeah, I love that note about community and connections and people bringing what they have to offer and building together. And hopefully, inshallah, like to rebuild all these places, Syria, Palestine, Libya, and our whole world, really, because in some ways we're all suffering from the destruction of colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we definitely rebuild our places and our spaces, but I do think that even the act of getting together and trying at the very least does rebuild yourself, your sense of
Mm.
self, um, which, for people who have endured so much suffering and loss is obviously really necessary. And I, for one, whenever I've felt really, desperately forlorn and sad and defeated, it has been being in community that's made me feel better, that has strengthened my resolve, that has brought out the hopefulness in me. It's that sense of like, oh, okay, actually, really simply put, like there are still good people in the world, right?
Mm.
And then from there, you can do something, anything really. But without that, we actually have nothing. That's when we're completely lost. That sense of like isolation and loneliness and that powerlessness. That's when we've really gone, you know,
Yeah, amen.
a
Well,
woman.
amen. That's true. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Layla, for coming on. Is there anything we haven't chatted about that you want to talk about? I mean, I guess gender is one of them. That should be a whole
God,
podcast in this.
that might be a follow-up podcast. We'll talk about gender. Um, God, now I'm on this. Why is always have it on the spot? Is there anything? I don't think so. I think we've covered most things.
Yeah, yeah, we covered a range.
We covered a lot.
Well, if
Yeah.
people want to keep in touch, follow your work, listen to your podcast, read your upcoming book, how do they get in touch? How do they find you?
So most of my social media profiles are under my name, Layla Maghribi. Third Culture Therapy is the name of the podcast. You can also find that on usual listening platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. My website, laylamaghribi.com, is another way to find out some of my previous work, and Substack as well. If you want to sign up to that newsletter, that will make sure that you don't miss any new episodes of Third Culture Therapy because I send out the alerts on there. That's pretty much most places you can find me. As for the book, yes, well, the book is still in progress. I am midway through. I am fingers and toes crossed, inshallah, gonna have it finalized, well, in a form that is fairly final by this summer. And then after that, we will see what lucky publisher gets to do the honors and publish it for me. We'll see. That's very much TBC, but soon, I hope.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. Such an honor and pleasure to have you here, and always good to chat with you. I learned so much, and I'm so grateful for our friendship and our connection. And yeah, it's so beautiful sharing this life with you.
Yeah, same, Hadar. It really is. It really is. And a very, yeah, very beautiful, spiritual, soulful connection. And I'm also glad to have learned a lot from you, really, about how to be spiritually connected, how to incorporate that into your daily life, which I have done a lot more in the past couple of years than I did before. I always felt myself as someone spiritual, but I still feel like I maybe had a bit of a separation of them. Sort of it was almost like my day job and my night job, but now and you've definitely been an inspiration for that, integrating it more so. And I feel like I'm always kind of holding my faith in God close to me now, which is a really beautiful feeling to have, especially in really difficult times like these. So thank you also for being that model and that role model, and yeah, making it a very welcoming, actually, uh, a welcoming thing to pursue. So
Mm.
I appreciate that and appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you. That means a lot. Okay.
All right. Well, till the next time, I guess.
Yes.
And come to London, please.